What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. So we're on to our next topic in developmental psychology, and we're hitting the age of development in which most of you are at, the adolescent stage in development. We're going to go over the kind of like physical maturity, moral development, cognitive development, and the psychosocial stages of life. So we're going to hit a lot of things here, a lot of big names, a lot of big theories you'll have to remember, and it should be directly applicable to you. So let's get started. So first up, we're talking physical development. And adolescence technically begins with puberty, so between the ages of 11 and 14, depending if you're an early, late bloomer, or just average. This is when our sexual organs mature, but it also has important implications for the way adolescents and young adults feel about themselves. Okay? Self-image can be greatly affected by when you physically mature, right? Like I just mentioned, late bloomers, early bloomers, average. That can have an impact on your self-image and your psychological state. So, early maturing boys, they tend to do better in athletics because they're obviously maturing earlier. They're more strength, taller, just bigger in general, and are generally more popular and have a more positive self-concept because of that early maturation. However, something to consider. Through some studies they've done, they also tend to have a little bit more difficulty in school because they can commit more acts of delinquency, become more involved in things with substance abuse and drugs, seemingly due to the fact that they look a little bit older, so they're accepted by and hang out with the older crowd, right? And that can lead to issues because they're not psychologically at the same point, even though they may physically be. But in the long run, it seems that early maturing boys are typically more responsible and cooperative later in life as they've gone through some of those challenges earlier, and it can benefit them down the road. As for girls, early maturing girls are more sought after for dates and have better self-esteem than later maturing girls. But developing early in life can be a bit embarrassing for girls, especially if you're the first one who's developing in your class. Can lead to some teasing and making fun of and things like that. So there's positives and negatives to early maturation and early bloomers. On the flip side, late maturation can produce some psychological difficulty for both boys and girls. Boys who develop late are often a little bit smaller and less coordinated throughout that time of adolescence, which can lead to some ridicule, seen as less attractive. And if they allow that to creep into their own self-concept, they can begin to view themselves in that way, and that can be psychologically detrimental. Girls who develop later, they're at a little bit of a disadvantage in junior high and early high school. Due to holding a relatively lower social status, they might get overlooked in the dating pool, looking for significant others in that time. But as time goes on, throughout high school, they report greater satisfaction with their bodies. Later in high school and college, mainly because those late maturers tend to be a little taller and more slim, which is the societal ideal of beauty, right? So again, there's positives and negatives to both sides of these early and late physical development and maturation throughout adolescence. So if we're moving into cognitive development now, right? So usually by adolescence, you've reached the formal operational stage in Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So you're beginning to reason hypothetically, deduce consequences, and it can lead to greater understanding and comprehension of these broad moral principles of life. You can have these discussions and talk about these deeper issues and things as you go through this stage. So reaching this cognitive stage of development can lead you into some types of moral development. So we're going to go over now Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development and moral reasoning. And he believed that this moral reasoning helped guide our judgments and behavior, and he proposed dilemmas to help people reason at different levels. So you have different moral dilemmas, and based on your responses, you'd be categorized in one of three stages of moral reasoning. Okay? And his theory assumes that people move through these levels in a fixed order. Okay? There aren't really specific age ranges. We'll see some later that kind of in general match up, but he believed that you couldn't reach the highest level until at least 13 because cognitively you weren't in Piaget's formal operational stage yet. You couldn't understand the hypotheticals and the more broad philosophical issues in the moral reasoning of that highest level. So let's go through the three levels. First, you have pre-conventional. This is where we perform actions based on rewards or punishments. So this is generally typically in young children, right? They're very selfish and self-centered in their morality because they don't want to be punished for something, and that's why they don't do something that's considered wrong because they're afraid, and if they do something that's considered correct or right, they're doing it because they think they're going to receive a reward for that. Moving into level 2, we're reaching the conventional stage of moral development. This is when people are interested in pleasing others and doing what is right by social laws. Okay, so in this instance, it's different than pre-conventional because people are considering more than just their self. Right? They think of family, they think of loved ones, and they think of society as a whole. So it's more than just I'm going to do this because I want to be rewarded for it, or I'm not going to do this because I'm going to be punished for it. I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. I'm going to follow the rules of society, and we shouldn't steal, we shouldn't impact violence or things like that on each other because it's not the right thing to do. So you're following social laws because you're thinking of the society as a whole rather than just yourself in the pre-conventional stage. So when you move to the third and final stage is post-conventional, and Kohlberg argued that many people don't even make it to this level of reasoning. He would say a lot of people are stuck conventional, but post-conventional uses this higher reasoning to guide our behavior. And they think about terms of things like justice, equality, basic human rights when they make their decisions. So when you're post-conventional, you might do things that are technically against the law because you're considering these higher ideals of equality and justice and things like that. You're living by the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Okay. And that would explain, thinking a little bit deeper about these issues rather than just what's basically right and wrong. Okay? Like we said, Kohlberg didn't think that many people would make it to this level of reasoning. And this could be anywhere from, that late or early teenage years all the way through adulthood, if you can think at this level. Here's just another visual representation of the levels of moral development. We really focus on the 3 levels, but within those 3 levels, Kohlberg also broke them down into 2 stages each. So, pre-conventional, avoiding punishment and self-interest. Conventional, you have a good boy attitude, law and order, morality, you follow the law, you want to do what's right based upon that. When you move into post-conventional, you get into the social contract, the agreement between human beings and the government, and just different principles that you hold. And you can think in that way of moral reasoning based on personal ethics. Okay, so those are the different levels and the ways we move through them. Now, we move on to one of the biggest topics in developmental psychology, and that's Erickson's psychosocial development. Now, this is across the lifespan, but we put it here in the adolescent section because the adolescent stage of psychosocial development is a big one for Erickson. He focused heavily on it, so that's why we put it here with adolescence, even though it covers from birth through end of life. So these psychosocial development involves our changes in our interactions and understanding of one another, as well as our knowledge and understanding of ourselves as members of society. Right? So he believed that we pass through the stages, and to pass through certain stages, it requires the resolution of a conflict. And you'll see 2 different terms at each stage that represent the conflict of that stage, and you must resolve that conflict to not have any psychological distress or anything like that moving forward. So first up, our first stage of life, from about 0 to roughly 18 months, is the trust versus mistrust stage. And the basic question here, you're asking yourself as a young child or as a baby, as an infant, can I trust the world? Right? And it makes sense. These children or infants are dependent on others to meet their physical needs, not just physical needs, but also social and comfort needs for love. So trust versus mistrust. If you move through this conflict with trust, your parents care, and you become attached, and you'll develop a strong, secure attachment, a sense of trust and predictability, and be able to trust the world around you. If you develop some mistrust, there's some inconsistent or lacking care through this stage, and it will cause the infant to develop a sense of mistrust or paranoia or anxiety. Right? So notice we have some synonyms here for you. Paranoia, anxiety, stress for mistrust. You the sense of predictability, secure attachment for trust, because if you ever had to write these in an FRQ, we got to use synonyms, right? So some big important events in this stage: feeding, right? Because it helps develop that sense of trust and predictability between the infant or the child and the caregiver. So as you move through that stage, from 18 months to about 3 years old, you come into autonomy versus shame and doubt. And the big question you're asking yourself, do I have some control over my life, right? In that sense, it means, do I have a sense of free will? Do I have some choices that I can make? That's autonomy, right? If parents set boundaries, but they let their children make some decisions, they'll develop a will or a sense of independence. And you can relate this back to authoritative parenting style, right? That will help a child develop a will or a sense of autonomy, a sense of independence. If parents are overly strict, children will be unable to assert themselves. And if parents are too lenient, children will become overly demanding and controlling, and will also have a sense of shame or self-consciousness. Right? So these first couple of stages really depend on parents and guardians to help them move through and resolve these conflicts appropriately. So some examples of things that may help with autonomy, some important tasks, picking out your own clothes, feeling like you can dress yourself, choosing toys, you like by yourself, mastering potty training in the toilet. All of those can help develop autonomy. Now, from autonomy, you move to initiative versus guilt. And this is, am I capable of doing things for myself? Which is different from autonomy versus shame and doubt. Here you're thinking, do I have some control over my life? Can I have a sense of independence? And now it's, am I actually capable of doing these things? And through this, there's a lot of imagination that you develop, a lot of curiosity, and asserting your independence. If your parents react positively to these things, the child will feel confident. They'll take risks and have self-confidence. Right? That's initiative, right? Self-confidence. If parents react negatively, they punish a child for the things they're trying to do, the imaginative curiosity that they have. They'll lack self-sufficiency and have a low self-esteem and fear punishment. So they'll develop this guilt and not try to do things on their own and not assert that independence. Right? So big question here. Am I good or bad? Am I capable of doing these things for myself? And the important events for this stage, allowing children to explore and play independently and do things that they are interested in. As you move on and you get to school age, we're talking industry versus inferiority. And this is, am I capable of doing things socially? You compare yourself with others, other peers socially and academically. Okay? And the important event here is school, because you're at school age. That's where you're spending most of your time. And if you feel that you can do these tasks, you have a sense of pride that you fit in. Maybe you're really good at social studies or math and you feel great about that. That gives you a sense of industry. Or, you join the basketball team or the band and you do well there. You're developing a sense of industry in something and you're becoming good at that. If you aren't allowed to do those things or you can't find a place where you fit in, you can feel inferior or not as good as others. That can lead to that sense of inferiority, right? Like you're less than for some reason. Okay? So your basic virtue, you're trying to seek competence, industry. Am I good at something? Can I find something that I am good at in those school age years? Then we move on to identity versus role confusion. And this is the stage that most of you are trying to resolve at the moment. I'm sure you're well aware of that, especially as juniors and seniors. You're trying to figure out, who am I and where is my place in this world? You're going through a transition. You're going from childhood into adulthood, and you're trying to discover who you are, what your strengths are, what kind of roles you're best suited to play. And you ask yourself that question, who am I? So your important events here are your social relationships as you interact with other people. You try to figure out what best suits you, right? You have a sense, if you're developing identity, you have a sense of who you are and a commitment to future adult roles. You kind of determine, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to go, this is what I think I want to do. If you're a little confused over what role to play, that can lead to an unstable identity, and it can lead to the adoption of some socially unacceptable roles. And you can start to do some things that maybe you wouldn't normally if you had some idea of where you wanted to go in life and develop that identity. So to continue that, pressures to identify with what one wants to do with one's life are acutely felt. Okay, we just essentially said that, right? You can feel this. You're like, there's a lot of pressure in school, a lot of pressure in life. You're going to move on soon. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? Are you going to go to college? Are you going to go get a job? You're going to go to the military. And as a result of that pressure, you start to separate yourself from your parents and you rely more on your peer group and your friends, right? You take into account their opinions more and what they're doing more often. It's a pivotal time, and it starts to pave the way for the continued growth in the stages after this, and develops our, future of our personal relationships. So Erickson believed that you had to find yourself and figure out your role before you could truly feel and express love. So this is why we place this one in the adolescent notes, because he put a lot of emphasis on identity versus role confusion. He would say you need to find yourself first in your identity before you can move on and express love and figure out the future of your life. So that would be why you hear a lot of people talking about high school relationships and saying, you don't even know who you are yet. That relationship, and the classic idea that when one of those people goes off to college or they leave or they graduate, those relationships don't last very long. Maybe some do, some don't, but that's because people are still trying to find themselves, and they're changing quite a bit in this stage of life. So as you move through there, you find your identity and your role. You move into intimacy versus isolation. Your 20s, in that decade of 20 to 30, and you're moving on from just casual relationships into ones that are more serious, and you're looking for maybe a potentially life partner. And the question is, can I love and be loved? Right? You're pondering entering into that close, loving relationship. If you do develop intimacy, you find someone you can develop a sense of connectedness. Okay? If not, and you're struggling, you could develop into isolation and draw into yourself and avoid close emotional contact, kind of shut yourself off, wall yourself off, and never let anyone in, right? So this important event in your 20s and 30s is to get into some romantic relationships and see and develop that intimacy and sense of connectedness to move through this stage effectively. So as you get into your middle adulthood, 30 to 65, the issue becomes generativity versus stagnation. And this is the stage that I'm about to enter into, right? So am I productive in giving something back to the world? So once you have your identity, hopefully you're in a loving relationship, you start to think, okay, am I making a difference? Should I have children? Do I enjoy my job? Does my job make a difference? Am I involved in my community? And the real question is, how can I contribute to the world? If you are experiencing generativity, you're happy with life, you feel like you're making a difference, you have this sense of accomplishment. If you go through stagnation, it's kind of like that midlife crisis that people talk about. You're feeling worthless. You feel like your job isn't benefiting anyone. You feel like you can't benefit the world, and you have this preoccupation with your own needs, and you feel like your own needs aren't being met. So it's a struggle, and it can cause significant psychological difficulty. As you move through that stage and you work through your feelings of generativity versus stagnation, eventually you reach our final stage, which is integrity versus despair. And this is our usually our retired population, 65 plus, towards more towards the end of life. You start to reflect back and you think, has it all been worth it? You review your life, right? Kind of like we're doing with our developmental scrapbook. At the end, we review the life and the life that we've had and that we want to have. And if you look back at it happily and you have a strong sense of self-acceptance, and you feel a good sense of generativity, and you feel intimacy and you feel purpose, and you've moved through these stages effectively, you're going to feel integrity and you're going to feel great about what you've done. On the flip side, despair, if you develop a sense of despair, you look back at life with frustration, regret, and disappointment, and maybe you think, you really stagnated during that midpoint of life. You never developed those close, intimate relationships. You never really felt a sense of identity, and that can lead to despair and some tough times towards the end of life. So that wraps up Erickson's stages of psychosocial development. We touched on Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and we talked about adolescent physical development, and how we are in the formal operational stage of Piaget's cognitive development. So a lot of terms and names there. We're going to apply all of these to our developmental scrapbooks and make them more relevant to your life. Okay? If you have any questions, please let me know.